with Apple? 2 minutes to go. So tell me, is your phone exactly... Everybody? Yes, Mr. King, if you just stay seated, please. Scuttling around the chamber. All right, welcome everyone. I declare the meeting of the Finance Committee meeting of Tuesday, the 7th of November open. And my first order of quick thing on the things is to call for apologies. I have an apologies from James. No one else is. Martin's not here. Does anyone know about Martin and Dave? Okay. Okay. And Martin for lateness, or is he not? No one's heard about Martin. Okay. So. I'll move that we accept apologies from James Casson and lateness from Dave McPherson and Martin Gallagher. I'll move. Martin's just made the cut. You're no longer late. So just Casson and McPherson. Those in favour, those against, carried. Thank you. I seconded and Siggy. I moved and Siggy seconded. I'll confirm the agenda, noting that we have changed things around a wee bit to fit in our guests today. So I'll move the agenda. I have a seconder. Mallet Casson. Those in favour, those against, carried. Tooman, sorry, I'm thinking of Tooman. You cops, you all look the same to me. Declarations of interest. Is there any declarations of interest? Thank you. I'm not aware of anyone here for the public forum, and there isn't, I don't think, looking. Confirmation, so we're on item 5, confirmation of the minutes of the meeting of the 26th of September 2017. Yes, Siggy.
I should put an apology in that day, and it's not noted down.
Okay.
Yeah, if that could just be noted. Was it? Am I blind? Oh, thank you, but I can't see. Ah, there. And sorry.
You're Councillor Henry, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah, you're there.
Thank you. Yeah, I am.
Okay. Is there any other points about the minutes? Okay. Just there are 3 issues in the minutes which required some work to be done by staff. One was under point 7, paragraph 7, Chair's report, to circulate more information regarding Claudelands. Is that underway?
Oh, look, I apologise for that, Chair. We'll get that out to you by the end of this week. Thank you. Sorry, I overlooked on my part.
The second one is point 8, which was staff undertook to provide committee members with further information concerning depreciation and pensioner housing financial. Any timeline on that one? Who's going to apologise this time?
Have information on the accessible report.
Okay, is that the response to that? Is it? Okay, thank you. And number 9, staff noted that a report would come back to future growth, so that's underway. Is there any timeline on when that will be?
Whether we did bring it to the last G&I.
So it was an update regarding the ring road?
Yeah. We did that at last G&I.
Okay, that's been done.
Yep.
All right, thank you. And the other thing was the last point on page 10, there was a resolution to exclude the public. Angela voted against that, and that's not noted. So we're going to update that. Thank you. All right, subject to those issues, I'll move we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the 26th of September 2017. Can I have a seconder? Mallet, Bunting. Those in favour, those against. Carried, thank you. Now we move on to the highlight of the meeting. Pardon? The Chair's report. If this continues... all right, I'll take that as read. Just one thing. The report was written before the final agenda was prepared. So if you go to the third under the first item, restatement of rates revenue, the third paragraph refers to the second line of the bolded paragraph as page XX. That is page 25. Other than that, I'll take it as read. Are there any questions or comments? Yeah, Rob.
Thanks, Chair. I've got a couple of questions in respect to part 2 of your report. As Chair of Finance, is there a particular outcome that you were expecting from the comments that you've made in your report in respect to the long-term plan discussions?
What I'm trying to do is identify the issue of what is necessary and what is not necessary. As I said in the report, every councillor around this table will have a different point of view on that. And I've also particularly trying to make sure that whilst we spend a lot of time making sure that our decisions don't impact or don't have a negative impact on council's sustainability, fiscal sustainability, that I think we also need to broaden our our view and make sure that that our decisions don't have a detrimental impact on the financial stability of our ratepayers and residents as well.
So just following that on, as Chair of Finance, and that's my emphasis, are you unhappy with the progress that we're making to date in the sense that we may not be able to differentiate between what the city needs and what the city wants?
What's the city?
The residents of the city. I mean,
Yeah,
we're
and how many
putting
of those are
together. No, we're putting together a budget for the city for the next 10 years in the long-term plan. And I just had a little bit of a concern when reading this that perhaps you might be unhappy that we haven't sorted the wants from the needs.
Well, we haven't even addressed that yet.
Song there.
We haven't even addressed that. Obviously, everything so far has been a briefing, and we have had a whole lot of options that are floating around. A lot of options about additional rates we can charge, development contributions, fees, all sorts of things. The changing of our speeding up of our transfer from land to capital valuations, all sorts of stuff. No decisions have been made on those. But I have been concerned and have been publicly and just about every meeting I speak about that I think we have spent too much time or putting too much of our emphasis on raising revenue rather than reducing costs, which won't be a surprise to anyone sitting at the table, I don't think.
Okay, my last question is really around using the last 3 months' figures as a lead-in. Do you think that's fair to use the last 3 months' figures to preempt the fact that we perhaps need to? I mean, to me, I guess my question is around the importance of revenue as opposed to spending. And whether or not the last 3 months is a fair comparison to use when we have got perhaps longer term. We've got figures that rate back over a much longer period to base how we might determine the direction of travel for the 10-year plan.
I'm sorry, I don't understand
That was my question, not specific. Do you think it's fair to have used in your report the last 3 months as an indicator of perhaps the financial concerns that you've got in this leading into this formulating and planning of the long-term plan?
So you're going back to the first
The
thing
first
where
part of your,
Yeah, yeah.
of part two, yeah, where you've focused just on the last 3 months.
Yeah, and that's
not
about,
earlier
and,
years.
and that's not about going forward, that's about the restatement of the rates revenue.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
No. It's if you look under part two of your report.
Oh,
You've
okay,
got
yeah,
what we need and what we want, and then you've got 1, 2, 3, and then you've got the last 3 months of our results as a I suppose as a precursor to the concerns about the fact that maybe our wants are greater than our needs in terms of how
Yeah,
we
so-
might land with the 10-year plan.
So your question, is it right that I should...
Is it fair to use just those 3-month figures, the start of the year, as opposed to perhaps the 12-month figures that we've got relating to 17, 16 and 15 as an example of results that will help us plan the 10-year plan that we'll be doing over the next few months?
All I've done is explained, elucidated to councillors what is in today's report with regard how each of those 3 measures that we use are tracking, that the one that one of the ones to which we're moving towards, but it's not exactly the one that we're moving towards, is that we're showing a deficit of $600,000 rather than a surplus of 15.6 million. That is telling us what we've done in the last 3 months. If you look back, you'll find that our salary costs are going up up and up and up. Our depreciation costs are going up and up and up, and that's for the last 3 or 4 years. All I've tried to do is bring some context about what is coming up for councillors in this report and showing what the impacts are. To say, am I concerned? Should we be using that as the basis? I think you're asking, should we be using that as the basis for our or any concerns I have about the 10-year plan? That is not the 10-year plan. Our 10-year plan is always looking forward, but if you're looking forward, you learn from what happened in the past so you don't make the same mistakes. And that's what my concern is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Angela.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'm just following on from Councillor Pascoe's question. On page 13, the bottom half of your statement, of your Chair's report, where you say, we all know that it's difficult to respond negatively to requests from members of the community for additional assets and or services, and then you go on to list some alternatives that pop up from time to time. What do you mean by we all know? What do you mean by it's difficult, and who do you mean when you say we all know?
Okay, if there's someone here who doesn't find it difficult to say no to people when they ask for something, would you put your hand up? But yeah, okay. What do you think that should say?
No, I'm asking you because it's
Oh,
your
okay.
report.
Okay, I would have thought that would be a common thing when someone asks you, can I have some money for whatever? I think the first reaction is, yeah, I'd like to help this person. Perhaps I've misjudged human character, human behaviour, but I don't think I have.
But you said we all know. Sorry, we all know that it's difficult to respond negatively to requests from members. What
Do you disagree with that?
No, I'm asking you. I'm trying to get some clarification here, because the points that you've put from 1 to 6 are your. I mean, that's principles that you govern by. They may not necessarily be principles that I govern by, but you've gone, we all know that it's difficult to respond negatively.
Do you disagree that some things are outside council's jurisdiction, that some things will benefit a disproportionately small number of residents? What are you disagreeing with, or what are you trying to
I'm trying to get clarification from you, Gary, on what you mean by respond negatively to requests. Are you meaning
responding negatively to a
day-to-day?
request is saying no. No, we can't do that. We can't afford that, or it's not our job. Someone else does that. Someone else can do it better. There's a different way of doing things. We're going to do that. That's what I'm saying about responding negatively. Those are examples of which is
Okay.
kind of what I've tried to be a bit little clearer in those 6 points I've put there.
Okay, yep. Thanks.
Thank you. Paula?
Oh, thank you. My questions do sort of follow on from the same line. Apart from the facts that are within it, most of this is your personal opinion, isn't it, at this point in time?
Most of it is not opinion, actually. I mean, 1 and most of 2 is fact.
There's a large, well, okay, I'll rephrase it. There's a large part that is your opinion, but I'm just wondering, in terms of the last set of bullet points, the 1 to 6, it's true, though, that the community has some say in the levels of service that they want council to provide, don't they, through the LTP?
Absolutely, yeah.
And that is a debate that not only will individual councillors perhaps have different views on, but the community at large will have a range of opinions about what they want provided. I know you hold different views about whether we should run pools, for example, or somebody privately should run pools, but that's a conversation to have coming up, isn't it? Yeah. That. And the other question was, you're saying that currently we do things. Are you suggesting that currently we do quite a lot that's outside of jurisdiction, could be delivered by other people, and without partnership? Is that what you're suggesting or somewhere else in New Zealand? Is that what you're suggesting in?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think the key point is that I respect every elected member at this table will have different definitions, understanding or expectations in terms of the priority given to those assets and services. So I certainly don't think that we're all clones here with the same views.
No, it's just interesting because this is very opinion-based, the second half of your report, that I just wanted to make sure that where your opinions lay. Thank you.
I don't know if it is opinion-based. I mean, we'll all have those 6 points I point down there. We'll all have a position somewhere along a continuum within that. Some of it will be legislatively determined, but often 80% of it isn't. It's our taste for things, or our philosophy, if you want. So everyone will have an opinion or a view on where on that continuum you place yourself.
Mr. Chair, you've said, but often those requests and asset services are. So you're making a statement of fact, whereas actually that is a statement of opinion, which of course you're entitled to, but should be expressed as such.
Okay. Yep. Martin.
Yes, obviously a chair's report, a mayor's report will reflect the viewpoint you bring to the task as a chair and as an elected member, and of course this council reflects a complete cross-section of the views, which is probably reflective of the wider community. And I always find, as you know, and you and I don't necessarily, we're in slightly different parts of a philosophical spectrum, I suspect, but I do find this chair's report quite good in the sense it's succinct. It clearly outlines the challenges as you see it, and I suspect the debates as you raise will be revisited multiple times, through our 10-year plan, obviously, where each individual elected member will have a lot of issues to grapple with in terms of the challenges ahead.
Thank you, Martin.
I thought we entered into the debate, but I'll wait for you to indicate when we're in debate.
Okay, sure.
I assume the Deputy Mayor has already. I've exercised my right. Has already.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll move the report be received. Do I have a seconder? Mark. Thank you. Mallet Bunting. So we're in the debate. Rob.
Thank you. Look, I'm not specifically intending to be critical of the Chair's report, but I do find the comments frighteningly unhelpful. I think what they do is they risk putting council into a time warp, looking at this long-term plan no differently than the way that council has looked at long-term plans in the past. Sadly, we focus on what we need and want, and then strike a rate to accommodate this. It needs to be the other way around. What income opportunities are there, and what's the best spend of this income? Exactly the way that we manage our own household budgets, or it should be anyway. I think the long-term plan is a time for fresh thinking, and those were the words used by one of our council colleagues in last year's election when she was successfully elected. I think this is the time when we should be looking at new ideas, fresh ways of looking at revenue and the way that we actually spend the money. And councillors may remember I distributed this report, the Local Government Funding Review, which was a discussion paper. I distributed this earlier this year, a funding paper issued by local government back in February 2015. And ironically, on the front page of the report is an almost empty jam jar. And so that's kind of the indication that nationally local government feel around where our funding revenue comes from. But what the report does contain is a number of funding options, and we should, as part of this fresh approach...
Sorry, Rob, are you talking about my report or that local government report?
I'm talking about your report, okay?
Oh, okay.
But I've introduced this as being an example of some fresh thinking coming through on a national level. So we should, as part of our fresh thinking, consider opportunities in our long-term plan that are in this report. And I think it's timely, given that we have now a new idealistic government, which is striving, certainly so far, to change the way New Zealand operates and is financially managed. And some of the suggested options in here are some that are currently being canvassed. For example, the regional fuel tax, and that could bring up to $13 million to Hamilton City Council, which would be enough, according to Chair McPherson, enough to fund the Access Hamilton budget. There's also in here the suggestion of a refund of the GST. It's rather ironic that rates are legislatively defined as a tax, and this is the only tax in New Zealand, that rates are the only tax in New Zealand that have GST added onto them. So if we were successful in getting the rate charges back, the GST back on the rates that we charge, there's another $24 million that the city could have as revenue. So I'd like to think that, arising from the Chair's report this morning, that we can make this a positive move in our long-term plan discussions that we'll be having over the next few months to find more positive ways of achieving good outcomes, rather than perhaps scolding councillors who want what they think is best for the city residents. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just wind up by saying it's funny how in the debate you've kind of reinforced what I was saying, Rob. Everything you talked about then was getting more money. And that is exactly the focus I'm trying to change us from, and say there are other ways of doing things, and there are reasons why we shouldn't be gouging our ratepayers, whatever you want to call it. And that's kind of what I'm saying there. And that will be predicated by each one of us around this table. As I said before, will have a different view on the criticality, or whatever the word is, between wants and needs. For every, it'll be libraries, it'll be sewage works, it'll be roads, it'll be swimming pools, it'll be all sorts of things. And we'll all have different views on that. And those views hopefully will be influenced by the people we're representing. So that's all I'm trying to bring out. And I've just I've just raised the issue that we need to be a bit, in my view, we need to be a bit clearer on what it is we need and what it is we want. And and I think that is the continuum, because I don't think the way we're going about it now, which to me appears to be, and I could be reading this wrong, but to me appears to be how can we get more money out of this thing, and the thing being the people we represent, rather than how can we do, what services do we no longer need, what services can be provided by other people, are there other ways we can do things that are a lot cheaper, all of those sort of things which we're spending, to my way of thinking, way too little time on, and spending, and Rob just, iterated it then by saying, here's all these other ways we can get more money out of people, with a fuel tax and all this sort of stuff. All of these things are about beating, as far as I can see, thrashing a dead horse. Anyway, is there any more discussion? All right. I'll move that the report be received. Those in favour? Those, sorry, this one might be close, so we might, actually we'll go to the board on this one. Okay, could you vote please? Thank
The
you.
motion is carried, 9-4, 2 against.
Thank you. Okay, we have our friends from Local Government New Zealand, Local Funding Agency. So we're on item 7, which is page...
So through the Chair, there's a number of annual reports that will be presented today, CCOs of Council, and probably the best way forward is, Mark, if you just introduce yourselves and then just present the annual report.
Sorry, just thank you, Mark, and thank you very much. The actual, it's in the second book that you've got, and it's page 4 of that one.
Today I've got John Avery, one of the independent directors on the board with me. Certainly appreciate the time to come and speak with you. Thank you for putting us first up on the agenda. I know being first on the agenda comes with the responsibility of keeping to time, and I do see you've got a big agenda today. So look, you've got in front of you I think a 4 or 5 page presentation, and you've also got in your packs the annual report. I thought that probably I'd just focus on 2 or 3 slides in our presentation for 5 minutes, and then leave you with the chance to question us on anything that you would like. So you do have the annual report in front of you. We're now, that's our 6th annual report, so we've been going for 6 years. We're up to 53 councils now, so we had 3 councils join in the last year. We're tending to getting between 2-3 councils every year now. We do have 95% of the sector borrowing, so we're covering just about every single council in the country. Of the 78, there's about 60 who borrow, so we're up to about 53 of those, but we've got 53 of the biggest. So we're continuing to pick up 2 or 3 councils per year. Market share as at June was 91%, as at September it's now 95%. The other key over the past year, non-financially, has been that our average borrowing margin continues to contract as well. So we're only now 58 basis points over where the government borrows. So we have the same credit rating as the New Zealand Government. So one of the keys to the model is that we keep our credit rating the same as New Zealand Government. We go after any investor who holds New Zealand Government bonds, and we get them to switch into our GFA paper. So, so that's been obviously successful in that our borrowing spreads are coming in, so we can pass those on to our council members. The other key event for the year was that we have now been able to lend to councils out to 16 years. So we keep saying when we first started in 2012, most councils could borrow for 3 or 4 years. You can now borrow out for 16 years to better match your assets and liabilities. So that's very good. And the key to us driving these cost savings for the sector is really the offshore investors. So we're still seeing offshore investors invest through us. We had 31% of our bonds are held by offshore investors as at June. It's now up to 34, almost 35%. So despite the political uncertainty over the last couple of months, we're still seeing month in, month out, the offshore investors are still supporting the sector because they have great confidence in the sector. So that's just a bit on the non-financials. The financials itself, of course, the council is a shareholder, so you're the second equal largest shareholder with 8 or 9 other councils. I think you've got about a 7.5%, 8% shareholding. You're also a guarantor. And you're in the top 5 in terms of borrowers from our GFA. We've had pretty significant growth in assets over the last 6 years. That growth will actually slow down in the next 3 to 4 years now. But as you can see, as at June 2017, we've got about 7.8 billion of loans out to councils, and we have other liquid investments as well. So balance sheet's about almost $8.5 billion. Importantly, as a shareholder, our equity continues to grow. So you've basically doubled your investment over the last 6 years. LGFA was not set up to reward shareholders. It was set up to pass borrowing savings through to the sector. But the shareholder capital has gone from $25 million to $54 million over that 6 years. And we've also paid out just over $7 million in dividends to our shareholders along the way, as well as generating you significant savings in your borrowing cost. As you can see, in terms of the financial year, we were slightly ahead of our interest revenue, slightly below budget in terms of our operating costs, so our profitability was slightly above where we forecasted. In the statement of intent, we had 5 primary objectives. We didn't meet 2 of them, and those 2, our average cost of borrowing to government bonds, we didn't meet that, and also the average margin we charge was a little bit above. That simply is a reflection of course, the longer terms that councils borrow for, the more we charge them. So therefore, if you came through and borrowed just for 6-month terms from us, it would be a cheaper borrowing cost. We would then go out and borrow cheaper. But because you're coming through and borrowing for 16 years, we're having to borrow for longer terms, we're paying more for it. So those 2 measures that we met are a little bit outside of our control. It really is a function of what councils are doing in terms of their borrowing intentions. So we're not concerned. They're the 2 SOI measures that we are happy to miss on. I probably won't talk about the value add from LGFA. I'll probably just go straight to the AGM, which is on the 21st of November. There's a couple of agenda items on the AGM. We have looked with an external independent review undertaken by the Shareholders' Council. We're proposing we are going to reduce the board size from the current 7 directors or 7 spaces to 6. We've also now had the first of the independent directors after 6 years coming up, and she has decided to resign. And the Shareholders' Council has been through a review process, a recruitment process, and they've got a very strong candidate for your consideration. And then the final on the directors is that our non-independent director, Mike Timmer, is up for re-election, and he's being challenged by Auckland Council for that position. Directors' fees, independent review, they've been benchmarked, and they're considering that Shareholders' Council's recommended that directors' fees increase. Last time directors' fees were increased were, I think, 3 years ago. The company's doubled in size since then. There is a lot of liability attached to being a director, and I think the important thing here to say is that directors are there to protect the interests of you as a guarantor and the shareholder. You've got to pay these directors very well because they are representing you and your contingent liability. And then finally, we've got some changes to the Treasury policy, which are up, and that's just, I said, simply reflecting the fact that the company is growing strongly, and also the fact that we're expecting the major banks to be downgraded through the fact that the Australian government is likely to get downgraded. That will then flow through to the Australian banking sector, which flows through to the New Zealand banking sector. So we just want to future-proof our Treasury policy to ensure that we don't have a breach just simply through something outside of our control. So that was hopefully a very brief overview, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mark and John. Any questions? I've got a couple. In the chair's report, and I know you're not the chair, just the wording, so it's the 1, 2, 3, third paragraph down, which starts off with the words net interest income.
Yes.
Goes on to say, rather than repay their loans early, a significant number of councillors have placed the proceeds from refinancing on term deposit with banks. Does that mean that they're borrowing from you guys and at a cheaper rate than they're then getting from a deposit at the bank?
A much cheaper rate. So what you can do, it's always prudent.
How do we get into that? How does an individual get into that?
You can't, because you need to have a very, so we're the cheapest borrower in the country after the government, and so therefore we put a very small margin on. Hamilton borrows 0.1% over what we borrow, so Hamilton is effectively borrowing through us at about 0.65 basis points over government bonds. The banks are very desperate for term deposit money at the moment. And so councils, borrowers, it's prudent to roll out your borrowing before it matures. So you could either extend the term of your borrowing and repay the borrowing from us, or what most of our councils have done, they've just borrowed from us ahead of their December 2017 maturity, gone to a bank, put the money on deposit with the bank and earned an extra, anything up to 1% extra on it. But you've got to access to cheap borrowing in the first place, which is how we provide it.
David, can you have a word with Mark after the meeting, please?
We actually did that.
Oh, did you?
Yeah,
So we're one of them. Okay.
Look, of our 40 councils have got loans maturing in December. I would say probably 35 of them have actually done that sort of thing as a result. It's smart to do.
It was also somewhat risk management for being able to, knowing you could borrow the money at a point certain, it might have been May or June or whenever, rather than wait till, say, now and end up finding it more difficult or more expensive.
So, as you said, the banks are desperate for deposit money, so that's... This would be an unusual circumstances, wouldn't it? Is this an unusual thing to happen?
Yeah, I suppose it's just at the moment because of the Reserve Bank requirements on banks from a capital point of view that they do have to go out and get term deposit money, and from a bank's perspective they don't mind where that term deposit money is coming from, be it you or me walking in off the street or large investment funds or councils or other organisations. So it's just the structural nature of the New Zealand market. It looks like it will continue for some time. It doesn't look like it's going to change in the near term, so we'd expect this to continue for a number of years.
Okay, thank you. And on page 34 of your, so this is, so it's in
Yes,
councillor's agenda, it's page 37, but you've got your own report, so it's page 34 of your report. Just your net interest income, and this is a small percentages, it's just dropped a bit this year. From last year, it was about 5.6%. So I'm talking about the 15.5 million you earned last year versus the 17.5 million you earned this year.
Yes.
That's
an increase of $2 million.
Yeah, but the actual percentage has dropped a wee bit, so that's margins
so our
dropping.
net interest margin's falling. That's because the councils are in such a strong financial position that most councils are getting a credit rating upgrade, and we charge lower margin for councils to better the credit quality. So that's a result of that. And also the other issue is that when we first started 6 years ago, our average on lending margin was 35 basis points. Since then, we've brought the margins into 10 or 11 basis points. So some of those old loans are rolling off. So we'll naturally see this. If you look at our, we won't go today, but if you look at our SOI for the next 3 years, you will see that our net interest margin continues to erode as a result of the fact that those old high earning loans are rolling off, being replaced with better loans through better councils at a tighter margin.
I've just got two more. We spend a lot of time talking about our debt to revenue ratios. To what extent, obviously that's a big thing for you guys. Where's your stance on it? Should it be 200%, 250%?
Okay, so we've always said that, and I gave this lecture back in April, we're here for the 53 councils, we're here for the 44 guarantors, we're not here for 1, 2, 3 or 5 councils. It's very important to remember that you've got obligations as a guarantor. Look, the debt to revenue of 250% was set in conjunction with the credit rating agencies back in 2011.
When the thing was all set up?
When it's set up to maintain the credit quality of the book. That implies a credit rating of S&P around about A+. So
about what?
A+.
Oh,
so you go AAA, AA+, AA, AA-, A+. So, so that's where those ratios have been derived from. We like to see councils obviously well under that because we like to see councils with some financial headroom so that in case something ever happens, then they have got some room to manoeuvre as opposed to being up against the threshold.
Okay, thank you. And just, has the local government funding agency considered lending to, I guess you'd call us sort of sovereign or something like that, but, you know, like third party or...
So like a CCO subsidiary?
Yeah.
So it's set up, we'd have to
in.
go to shareholders for a change in that. LGFA is set up so that we have to lend to the parent councils secured against rates revenue. The parent councils can then on-lend to their subsidiaries. So Auckland does that for Watercare. Christchurch does that for Christchurch City Holdings Limited. We won't lend directly through to the subsidiary companies because we don't have the security over rates. We could look at that going forward, but we'd need shareholder approval for that. So that's our position currently.
Does that answer the question? Okay. Thank you. Are there any... Rob?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for coming along, Mark and John. You mentioned about the downgrade coming through via the Australian government to the banks. Will that downgrade affect LGFA in the sense that you will also have to pay, I guess the effect of a downgrade is that interest rates, offshore interest rates, will go up. Will that impact on LGFA's borrowing rate offshore?
No, it won't. So long as we
assuming you don't get the downgrade.
We maintain parity with the sovereign, New Zealand sovereign, then it'll be fine. And this is why we also are trying to diversify our investor base to get more offshore investors in, because then it insulates ourselves. What it does do, if the downgrade did occur under that scenario, then the domestic banks' funding costs would be higher, and then our comparative advantage in funding the sector would get even bigger as well. So you'd probably make even more money on your term deposits on the other side, arbitrage. So if anything, no, it doesn't. There'll be valid reasons for the Australian government being downgraded. So investors look at that and they don't just naturally then go, everything in Australia is going down, therefore everything in New Zealand's going down.
Okay.
The Australian government's already AAA, New Zealand government's only AA+. So New Zealand is already one notch lower than Australia.
Okay. And the second question is, when you were here in April, we, I think, quizzed you reasonably intensively about the HIF and the impact of the, potentially HIF borrowings that Hamilton might need in order to fund our growth and what impact that would have on our existing loans and so forth. You mentioned at the time that you were also involved in discussions with the then government, as we have been through MB and so forth, to try and find alternative ways that the growth councils might fund, or how they might show the HIF funding in term. Given that we now have a change in government, and I haven't read anything yet in terms of the new government as to where they stand on the HIF funding, are you able to give us some sort of update as to what you might already know that we don't know, or what's going on behind the scenes in terms of a decision that I think we will be making next month, I think, around this table, in terms of taking up the opportunity for the previously promised HIF money?
Yeah, so I was in Wellington last week and talking to the Treasury and Department of Internal Affairs staff. They're just continuing on as they are. We've had discussions, of which Blair Blowcott's been involved with 2 weeks ago, around the documentation of the HIF loans. And so from an official advisor's point of view, official's point of view, life is continuing on, because you can't just stop at all. So from our understanding, it's continuing. Certainly the new coalition government, I believe personally, is more favourably disposed towards the sector than probably the previous administration. So I think that has got to be a good thing. LGNZ is going to be doing shortly a review of funding for water infrastructure, and I'm on that review group as I was on that previous one. I think Blair Blowcott is going to be on that LGNZ thing. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. The word I got back from officials last week was that they've never seen the level of activity coming out of the new cabinet compared to previous transitions. So the new government wants to do stuff. It wants to do stuff quickly. So I don't think they're going to hold up making a decision on such as the HIF and things like that. So I think it's carrying on.
So had you made quite significant progress since last April, you know, when in terms of discussions around how if we do borrow, and, you know, our borrowing may well be 180 million, I think, or 170 million from memory was the figure that we had been offered, although there's some subsidies and so forth to come in on that, as to what impact that would have if we borrowed it on our own books,
Yes.
as opposed to through other vehicles that were being suggested and I think partially supported also by LGFA.
Yes, so the view still hasn't changed. They haven't been able to get round the solution where any HIF loans are treated as loans and treated under your debt to revenue. So I think what's changed since then has been a greater acknowledgement of the use of the SPV vehicles, so the Crown Infrastructure Partners, but will effectively take it off local government's balance sheet and put it into effectively central government's balance sheet. So that's a positive step in the next I suppose part of the journey. So it's a positive development, but still any HIF loans will still be treated as debt. There's no way that anyone creatively can get around that.
Okay, so if it becomes an SPV, in our case, we will presumably not then be in breach if we end up in breach of our lending, or will you bring that back in a consolidated process?
It depends upon how it's structured, firstly. Okay. Secondly, we will always look to the rating agencies, okay, as to their treatment of it as well too, because ultimately at the end of the day, we don't want the rating agencies to view the council sector's credit to be going down, because if the council sector credit ratings are going down, our GFA will go down, then it all unravels. So ultimately we are guided by how the credit rating agencies will treat these SPV vehicles. They were the ones who said no, under the HIF, debt is still debt regardless of what it is. SPVs, I think they're only starting to have a look at them now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any? Oh, Andrew.
I'll move.
Oh, okay. I'll second. Okay, we're now on to debate. Is there any debate on? So all we're doing is receiving the report. Any debate? Okay, those in favour, those against, carried unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Carlos and Mark. So we're on item 8. Which is Waikato Airport, Regional Airport. G'day Mark, g'day Carlos.
I'll do that. Yeah.
So members, this is on page 87 of your big book. Photo of a Waikato rugby supporter on the front page then.
Right. Good morning, Chair. Just a time check for you. How long have we got?
15?
15?
20?
I'll do a speed read.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Martin?
I think we should take all the time we need with respect, Mr Chair.
Okay, can you get everything we need in 20 minutes?
Speed reading is not necessary.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Look, what we have for you this morning is obviously a very relatively brief presentation on the performance of the RAL Group, which of course encompasses the airport operation, our subsidiary property company and Hamilton Waikato Tourism. We have provided a full update at the shareholder briefing last month, but I'll just try and take you through some of the salient points. I think we've had as you'll see in the performance this year, we've had a very good year, and I think that's reflected in we've had fundamentally at the airport, we're seeing passenger growth again, and I'll talk you through those trends. Our property business plan has been developed and our property execution is well underway, and that's also been successful. And I think we've learnt quite a bit about ourselves this year with a very extensive piece of research that we conducted earlier on in the year, particularly around the airport and how the airport is viewed by our customers. So just moving very quickly into the financials at a glance. And look, the first point I would make is that our financial performance has been normalised. So there was a 3.3 million uplift through our P&L this financial year as a result of the gains on our investment property. So they have been removed for these numbers just to certainly normalise the year-on-year comparisons. So our operating revenue, as you can see, up 7% on prior year. And essentially, that's as a result of 300,000 from land sales and the balance from our airport operation, which I'll cover off specifically under the airport. Correspondingly, our EBITDA up a similar percentage, up 7%. And whilst we're obviously delighted that the EBITDA is up, we'd like to start to see some further fall through on our revenue growth in future years, but we have had some increased costs through the business this year, particularly in the overheads around our property initiatives and our property resourcing to deliver that plan. And finally, our net profit before tax, you can see they're up significantly on prior year. And really the trend lines there for you over the last 4 years across the operating revenue, EBITDA and net profit before tax is a pretty positive story. Looking at the airport operation again, and I'll just bring up the numbers for you. So you can see the trend line, again, operating revenue up for the airport, up 6% year on year. EBITDA only up 3%, and that's because a lot of the property costs initially sat in the airport financial performance that's been separately budgeted for this current financial year. And then you'll see again our net loss before tax. So a net loss of just under $50,000 for the airport operation, which was significantly ahead of prior year and significantly actually ahead of budget. So we're almost at a point where we're moving the airport operation in its own right into break even and in fact into, we hope, this current financial year, modest profitability. And of course, I'm sure, are aware that for the first year, I think it's probably in a very, very long time that Rail has paid a dividend to its shareholders of $200,000. And I think that's a reflection that the board had, that they wanted to demonstrate to its shareholders that we've taken the group from relatively poor financial performance 3 or 4 years ago, gradually improving its performance and into a position now where it can pay a dividend to you, and with the intention from the board that a dividend stream continues into future years. I want to talk very, very briefly here about land valuation this year because it's had quite a significant impact on the balance sheet. So I guess as a result of the general uplift in land value across the region, we have seen a significant increase. Firstly, you'll see that in our airport land holdings, our aeronautical land increased in value about 14 million, and I've already mentioned our investment property increased by 3.3 million. And on top of that, we had an increase in Titanium Park's development land holdings of roughly $2 million. So overall, and I'll come to the balance sheet in a moment, that you'll see how that has reflected quite a bit of activity in land sales, both land sale and purchase of land during the financial year. So the first key point is that we purchased the 98-hectare farm that was under original joint venture ownership between Titanium Park and McConnell and Todd property. They subsequently, after we dissolved the joint venture, put the farm up for sale, and Rail made the decision to acquire that land. We believe it's in a very strategic position on that northwestern corner of the aerodrome, both for sort of aeronautical and for non-aeronautical sort of future opportunities. And at the same time, we contemporaneously sold just under 7 hectares of land that we had on the western precinct. So that land was sold, so we bought the farm for 8.25 million. We sold the land on the western precinct for 3.25 million. So it partially funded, but as importantly, it discharged our future obligations to develop the land holding on that western precinct, which we were under with our previous joint venture partner. We would have been required to fund the infrastructure development on that land. So now they own all the land on that western precinct, which if any of you have driven out there recently, you would have seen the massive Visi building that's under construction. So they own all of that land, so it tidies up that border ownership as well. So that lifts our overall land holdings from about 250 hectares to 350 hectares that the airport owns. So as I've mentioned, and I'll bring these all up very quickly, so that's had quite an impact on the balance sheet, as I've mentioned. So we've seen the total assets of the group move up to just over 100 million, up 25% year on year. We've seen our liabilities move up 17%, or just so to 21 million. So there we've a situation where, even though we've purchased the farm, we offset it with the land sale. And we've also offset that with the cash flow of the group, and also some land sales on the central precinct on the terminal side of the airport. We sold about $1 million worth of land on the central precinct as well. So all of that has seen our assets proportionately increase well and truly over our liabilities. It's obviously improved our equity position, certainly from a shareholder position. That's moved the equity ratio up from 74% to 80%. Just now, a very brief update on the airport. I won't spend too much time on here, other than to demonstrate the point that our passenger numbers year on year increased 5%. I want to talk a bit more about that. So I'm just going to take some water. I feel like I've had 10 Heinekens last night at the moment.
How many did you have?
Only one. Okay, so, and I'll come back to the passenger story, but that is a bit, it's underwhelming. But if we look at our Air New Zealand routes, they've in fact in that year increased 10%. Somewhat masked on the year-on-year comparisons between the demise of Kiwi Regional Airlines and also the Hamilton-Auckland route. But on our on our Palmerston, North Wellington and Christchurch routes, we're seeing very strong growth. We're also fortunately seeing a significant increase in capacity provided by Air New Zealand. So you'll see in the year we've basically seen 40,000 additional seats go into our routes. And there or thereabouts, we've seen a slight deterioration in load factor, but really what you'll see in the story I'll tell you about the last 3 or 4 months is that we're seeing a significant uplift. So we're seeing an increase in capacity, and for the airline, they're maintaining load factors. Health and safety, again, very briefly, it's a very solid and safe story for you as a shareholder and for our people. We've had an independent audit during the year. And that was for both the airport operation and also for Hamilton Waikato Tourism, and other than some minor bits and pieces to work through that you always have with an independent audit, essentially very impressed with the health and safety framework that we adopt at the airport. Looking at the group property story, and again, I'll just try and pick up the salient points here that I haven't covered. very comprehensive business plan developed during the year, and the result of that has actually seen a significant uplift in activity. And the irony of the dissolution of the joint venture, we've seen more land sold and developed at the airport in the past 12 months than really has happened, well, potentially ever, but certainly in the last 5 or 6 years. So it's been a very successful period of time for McConnell and Todd on the Western Precinct, and a very successful time for the airport. So we've spent the period for us, the overall strategy, which I think you may well have been briefed on earlier on, but the overall property strategy here is to generate an additional $1 million in earnings before tax from property over the next 10 years. And that's really the intention from the board, to make sure that, if you like, the airport operation is insulated, because there are highs and lows of passenger traffic, influenced by the economy, tourism and all those other bits and pieces. And the property strategy, the non-aeronautical property strategy, just allows the group to chug along with a diverse income stream. So a huge amount of work has gone into understanding what sits under our land, our extensive lease portfolio, making sure that we maximise our entitlement as a landowner under our leases. So that's been the key focus really for the year. And we're very much into the implementation of the property strategy, which I'll talk a wee bit under the next couple of slides. Consumer research, I won't spend any time on this today, other than to let you know that we have started to, in much more detail, understand our customers. Firstly, we understood that our airport is actually essentially a 50-50 business and leisure airport, and that was quite a revelation to us. We thought it was a much higher business percentage than it is. So that sort of just helps us to determine how we communicate and influence the use of the airport. We're doing quite a bit to understand the propensity to travel, because often Hamilton Airport is not even under consideration by customers. And some of that is misconceptions, it's anecdotal information around price, availability, scheduling. And ironically, when we conducted a survey, which was pretty significant, 1,500 people were surveyed, there was even a lack of understanding of some of our routes, that we could even fly from Hamilton to Palmerston North, as an example. So there's a bit of work to do there to promote and market what we already have, and a bit of work to do to actually understand, and we tried to understand the perception between the congestion to and from Auckland Airport, and also travel from Auckland Airport, and how we can, I guess, take any of those advantages from that research piece. All right, just last couple of slides, really just moving into the current financial year. And look, we're now, of course, 4 months into the year. These slides were done, of course, a month or so ago. But the key point here is we are seeing, for the airport operation, very, very strong passenger growth. So we're encountering at the moment about 13% year-on-year passenger growth, which would be as strong in percentage terms as of any of the regional airports in New Zealand. Exceptional growth on the Hamilton Christchurch sector, where we're seeing 30% year-on-year growth over the last 4 months. And that was on the back of 20% growth on that route last year. So we've seen a significant increase in seat capacity by Air New Zealand, and obviously the uptake by customers to use it. And also the fact that you can now route through Palmerston North to Wellington has seen an upsurge, particularly in the Hamilton-Palmerston North sector. So overall, very, very encouraged by the passenger growth we're seeing, and that's obviously flowing through for us into our P&L performance, but I think it's also a very good story for the community. And that's also flowing through to some of our, if you like, the aeronautical markers, but non-aeronautical in terms of the car park. So we're seeing commensurate growth in revenue from the car park operation, and from our retail. So we're seeing a complete flow through of that activity. So you'll see there that we had some intentions to increase passenger numbers by 5%, so we're currently reforecasting based on what we are seeing, and we are getting capacity increases from Air New Zealand. Not always what I would like, but we are certainly, and I mentioned earlier on the growth that we're seeing. So look, if we continue to track this year, we will see the airport generate 50,000 additional passengers over and above 2 years ago. So quite strong growth. And if we look very much at the property story, again, we're looking to sell land of about $1.5 million worth of land this year in order to fund some of our infrastructure requirements. We have to date about 40% of those land sales have been made. So, you know, we're modestly on track. We've got a bit of work to do to actually get the balance in the bank over the next 6 months. We're about to extend Aussie James Drive. For those of you as you drive into the airport, it's the road off to the right that heads north. We're opening a further 250 metres of roading there to open up some land sales. We've already conditionally sold a couple of those sections. So there is quite strong interest there. We're under very strong negotiation with NZTA about reviewing our access entry points on the eastern side of the airport. So that's about looking to change some of the decisions made in 2007 about future entry to the airport. And those negotiations with NZTA and Waipa Council are going very, very well. So, so that's progressing. And that allows a more sensible approach to land development on both what we call our southern precinct, so the land to the south of the terminal, to the south of the hotel, and as I say, to the central and central north, and to bring back an entry point to the airport that actually marks it as a distinct entry and allows us to actually enhance that experience of arrival into the airport. So quite a bit of work going on in that space. And there's still a reasonable degree of interest. Certainly the change in government has caused the market to potentially pause a wee bit at the moment, but we are still receiving good levels of inquiry. A couple of buildings that have been under construction now. So Armagard are about to move in at Christmas time, which is the building that you can see if you drive out there, the big new tilt slab building. And another company has just begun construction there as well. So it's good to see some activity. It breeds confidence really in the area. Just finally, we've developed our conference facilities, and this is more a sales plug than a shareholder briefing, but we've converted what was the old international lounge area into 4 new conference rooms. We've invested in new furnishings and furniture and AV, and already in 1 month last month, we've almost generated the revenue that we generated the entire year last year out of conferencing. So we see it as a very successful opportunity to utilise an asset that wasn't being utilised, and also downstairs we have leased out some of the old downstairs international space to 2 tenancies that again will drive about an extra $80,000 or $90,000 of lease income next year. So it's about trying to, as I say, utilise those resources. And I think I can almost leave it at that. I don't know how I did for time, Gary, but hopefully that's okay.
That was great. Thank you, Mark. Just on page 93, sorry, of our agenda, is that me in the middle of the photo?
I don't, I'm not sure I have that photo that strategically
Members, if you
it
just
should
have
be.
a look at page 93, the good-looking bloke right in the middle of the is me.
You may have the full presentation, I think, there, Gary. I've only got...
Is this some sort of effort to curry favour or something, is it? All right, thank you. Thank you. Mark.
Thank you. That was my first question. Is that Gary? Page 96.
Just be careful, I don't think...
Oh, I beg your pardon. Page
no.
96 of
You don't
your
have...
report. Oh, okay. Basically, the bit where you mentioned about Air New Zealand, the numbers are looking good for Air New Zealand, basically. I presume they're constantly reviewing their routes. You know, they dropped the Auckland one.
Mm-hmm.
What indications have you had? Have they got any indications that they're going to add extra routes in there, or are they quite happy with what they've got at the moment?
Look, I think we always engage with Air New Zealand 3 or 4 times a year. I think as a general statement, Air New Zealand have got an issue with what they call metal, number of aircraft available to them, particularly on regional routes. So they've got a number of ATRs that are scheduled for delivery over the next 2 to 3 years. I think at the moment they're expanding their route capacity by upgauging the aircraft, so more ATRs and less Q300s, and I think that will be the strategy going forward. For Hamilton itself, there is they're not looking at any further route expansion at the moment. One of the challenges that we and many regional airports have is that Air New Zealand's strategy is very much a hub and spoke strategy. So flying regional to regional is just not a strategy they will entertain. So of course that limits the amount of airports that you can hub into. So for argument's sake, a direct Christchurch Queenstown, for argument's sake, is not a strategy that Air New Zealand wishes to employ. It would be via then Wellington or Christchurch.
So I presume they've got constant research going as to where people want to fly. So we don't
Yes, they have. And look, it's proprietary information, and Air New Zealand are relatively guarded about the commerciality. I mean, obviously they have a competitor in the domestic market. So, you know, we work well with them, but there's always they always obviously have a lot of information, particularly around passenger profiling, and take Hamilton, those passengers from the Waikato that are flying out of Auckland, or indeed their onward destination. So look, we have to rely on that, but we also continue, as I've always mentioned, we continue to meet with Jetstar, and I had a meeting only a couple of weeks ago with SCE, so we continue to stay engaged with all of the opportunities in the domestic market.
Right, that was my next question. Great, cool, thank you. I was a little bit confused, hence my quiet question to you before. It says Annabelle Cotton's been appointed chair, but John Spencer's the chair. Who's the chair?
No, Annabelle is the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, but
sorry.
John Spencer is still the chair of the board of the RAO Group.
Great, and his term is for a wee while yet, isn't it?
Well, look, I can't speak for John, but certainly, yes, he's there and intends to be there.
Great.
Yeah.
Are you getting? You mentioned earlier on there was a hold. It's the election came through and everything quietened down, but there's been a bit of press about the potential of Amazon and the likes. Have they approached you, or have you been talking to them?
Look, no, they haven't approached me, and I had this discussion with Mayor King about this a while ago. But look, they're only just considering Australia. We have tried an initial engagement with them, but I think it's a very, very long-term proposition for Amazon. So there's nothing. And look, they've just done a fair bit of work in Australia. In the US around settling their new head office, and I'm hearing bids of sort of $5-6 billion from cities to attract companies like Amazon to their cities. So I think it's a big piece of work for a future point, but I don't see at all there's any immediacy around it.
Okay, thank you. Just turning to the car park, last time you were here, you were talking about the idea of bringing the pay station in, and I'm not sure it's particularly response to this report, but how's the progress on that going?
So the car park, there's a couple of avenues here. Firstly, we have a major upgrade, software upgrade of the technology that actually is going in later this month. And that's been really around managing our compliance, what we call our PCI compliance. So that's about us wanting to remove responsibility for the retention of credit card information. Because that puts a huge onus and compliance and responsibility on us. So that's been a piece of work, ironically, that's taken about 9 months to put together because of our online partners, our banks, the operators of the hardware. So look, we wanted to get that piece of work done, and in terms of, that will, for argument's sake, provide a tap and go facility, which we haven't, so some of that technology which will actually streamline arrival and departure into the car park. In respect of moving the pay stations, it's a piece of wider work around how we locate the car park in future and how we upgrade it. Part of that, of course, has been reliant on the discussion I mentioned earlier on with NZTA about our access into the airport. So without sort of paralysis by analysis, there's a number of moving parts here for the car park. So I think it's a piece of work certainly that the board want the management team to look at during 2018. We thought we would look at it this year, but as I say, a number of these moving parts have delayed that.
Okay, cool. Is it, I'm just interested with the leases and the conferences and the really good work you're doing in that space, is it going to be big enough, that car park? Because it's normally a fair capacity.
Well, look, it's a very fair question. We monitor, obviously, the car park capacity. And ironically, we on any given day, we normally have at least 150 car parks available. It may not appear. We get down to... but the influence of conferencing is going to be the piece that potentially puts pressure on the car park. So look, we do have some options for conferencing car park out of the main car park if we need to consider that as a short-term solution. And we're also considering, ironically, a long-term car parking solution as well. So do we have some kind of car parking located well away from the terminal? Perhaps up on the Aussie James Drive extension that I've mentioned to you, so that customers firstly have a long-term car parking solution that's more affordable than main terminal car parking. So, and again, that's relatively easy to put in place. And so I think we've got enough options that it's a relatively important revenue earner, so I won't run out of car parks.
Especially since you dropped the free period down to 15 minutes. That's a long story. And finally, can you just give me a detail with the new entry to the airport? Where would you propose that would be?
So it would essentially be almost where about 100 metres north of the current entry. So we're proposing to have a roundabout there. So we have to have a roundabout somewhere on that eastern side of the airport.
Okay.
And then the proposition would be a roundabout there, which would allow access into what's called Gate Zero into Mystery Creek, which they open up for field days at that point. And it would allow then entry to the gun club, into the kart club, and provide entry into the airport. Then we would have a much smaller roundabout on our own land to then accommodate moving traffic flow around the airport, the car park, and up to Aussie James Drive. And it potentially provides a piece of land at the front of the terminal next to the airport hotel that could be better considered perhaps for retail options at a future point as well.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Dave?
Following Councillor Bunting's first question, which was a long time ago, the passenger numbers and the routes that are flown from Hamilton, how much of a risk do you see it having only 3 routes and only 1 airline involved there to the airport side of the operations, not the rest of the business obviously going well, Mark?
It's a significant risk, and it's a risk that I think that myself and the board are very aware of, because you can only influence the airline. You can't. They make those decisions, as you know. So certainly reliant on one. And look, a year ago, Palmerston North was a marginal route for the airline. So it's always something that we're very, very mindful of, and in fact, probably earlier on has driven some of our non-aeronautical strategy to make sure that if the airport was to lose a route, I feel much more confident now than in my 2.5 years at the airport that we've gone from, particularly for domestic trends, we've gone from negative passenger year-on-year growth to positive passenger year-on-year growth. So I think that's the story of regional development across New Zealand. So I'm quietly comfortable that we're in good shape, but there's always a risk.
Yeah. So just thinking about that Palmerston North route, I believe that's now the only region-to-region, i.e. non-hub related route left in the country.
Correct.
Yeah, and they did announce that they were going to can it a few months out, and it showed enough growth or enough positiveness to keep going and increase, I believe.
An increase. Look, the challenge for us is that that we can only record the so those customers that board in Wellington, transit through Palmerston North and then arrive in Hamilton are treated as a Palmerston North arrival.
Yes.
But of course they're not. What I would say is that if we combine Palmerston North and Wellington, we're seeing about a 7 or 8% year-on-year growth at the moment. So, which is in New Zealand are forecasting regionally about a 6 to 7% year-on-year growth. So it's sitting sort of in that acceptable frame, but certainly not as strong as the Christchurch route.
Okay, thanks for that. Just given the relative success of that Palmerston North route, even if some of it is actually Wellington, is there any pressure you think we could bring to bear to open up other regional routes, notwithstanding their stated strategy of hubbing everything? I mean, Nelson being one obvious one, but not the only one.
Yeah, look, we've raised it a number of times, and certainly, look, I talk obviously with my own colleagues at various airports, and that Air New Zealand simply will not entertain. So it would have to be with another carrier.
Yeah.
And look, we also see with Jetstar as a good example where, again, they tend to look at a hub and spoke methodology as well. However, I think where there is opportunity in future and some of the early discussions we're having is that there may be a way of picking up a Hamilton-Auckland sector via a Christchurch-Hamilton-Auckland or a Wellington-Hamilton-Auckland. Right. But the challenge for the airline is they need to see at least 50% of the seats need to be a point-to-point loading. So look, we continue to engage. We certainly don't get any. I mean, the engagement with both airlines is very positive, and we're starting to do more and more work with Christchurch Airport's a good example where they're advocating, as we are, about the success of that route and how that could be further enhanced.
Okay.
So,
just on the Wellington route, I've twice this year, including once just last month, had an issue with trying to get from Wellington to Hamilton on a Sunday, like there being no flights available quite a way out.
Yep.
I don't know whether there's none at all, or whether they're totally full. Is that an issue that you've noticed? Or
It absolutely is an issue. So what we are seeing is whilst we've had an increase in seat capacity, we are seeing peak hour flights in particular very heavily booked. So we're seeing flights out of Hamilton early morning and into Hamilton in the evening, often at between 90 and 100%, and often between 95 and 100% loadings. So our frustration, of course, is that the fares go up as the flights fill up, and then you simply can't access those flights. So we are mindful of that. The challenge for the airline, of course, loading on the aircraft in mid-afternoon. So it's a balancing act to get the capacity in there and then to get it well used.
So that does drive people to use Auckland as an alternative.
Absolutely, it does.
With the motorway on the weekends and so forth.
Yep. And don't disagree at all that's this dynamic challenge working with the airline.
Thanks. And look, the other question on a different aspect, we've in regional forums and transport forums been arguing for the route for a rail link with the airport to be kept on the western side of State Highway 3. If that did ever eventuate, in 20 or 30 years' time, is there carriageway space around the western side of the airport to accommodate a connection for freight, for instance, or even passengers potentially?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of aspects there. Firstly, we because of the engagement with NZTA on the eastern side of the airport, we have been engaging with them, particularly around Southern Links and understanding how that may influence the airport. Ironically, at the moment, and we've talked in those scenarios about a rail protection of a rail corridor. Ironically, some of the early planning of Southern Links doesn't allow for a train corridor under where the road goes where the new Southern Links goes under rather than over. So we've raised it, and I think we just continue to stay plugged into NZTA. But certainly at board level, we discussed this recently at a strategy session just around protection. And look, we all know technology. Will we need car parking as we know it in 20 years' time with driverless vehicles and electric vehicles and public transport? So we are very mindful that we have to, as best we can, advocate to future-proof.
Thanks very much, and I'm glad the GM of infrastructure is listening to the rail corridor issue and it not being provided for in Southern Links. Thanks.
Were you listening, Chris?
I've finished. Half your
Thank you, Dave. Paula.
Thank you. Good morning. Just a couple of questions that haven't been answered. I guess we were all interested in the interconnections of airlines. And I won't add anything more to that. I was just interested about the link to international arrivals. We talk very much in terms of domestic, but if you come into Auckland or Christchurch and an international flight, you can't actually get to Hamilton. As that conversation is also in the mix, I presume?
Well, absolutely it is, yep.
Okay.
And just on that point, there is, I think one of the other things that we have to start thinking about is how do we start to educate the public that you don't necessarily need, for argument's sake, to fly out of Auckland to go to Australia. You can perhaps go to Wellington from Hamilton and fly to Sydney or Melbourne. So there are different ways of thinking about some of those international connections as well, because people tend to think naturally north. But you don't necessarily need to do that, and it's easier to perhaps transit through Wellington Airport, domestic international, than it is through Auckland. So those sorts of conversations and ideas are being had as well. Cool,
because I must admit I haven't thought that way in the past either. Just interested in a couple of things. You made on your last slide some comments around properties. And selling a fair bit of property just of late, which has been really useful. And then in the third to last slide, and then you're talking about lease. So I just wanted to understand a little bit more around the balance between selling land and retaining land for lease, because once you've sold it, you've sold it, right? So it's good in the short term and in the long term.
Yep. I think that we often frame this discussion up by saying we're reluctant property developers and we want to be property investors. So the intention here is to and Mayor King reminds me about holding on to land as much as we possibly can, but we are at this point, I think the context should be very clearly understood that as I mentioned, we bought the farm, so we have 350 hectares, and our current property strategy suggests selling no more than about 15 to 20 hectares of land. So proportionately, we don't intend at this point, with our existing land holdings as we understand it, to do that. But look, we have to, it's very clear from the shareholders that our initiative needs to be self-funding. So in that sense, we have to sell some land in order to fund the infrastructure, the roading, the services. But our intention, as soon as we can during this transition, perhaps over the next 5 years, is to be doing our own design builds and retaining the land and leasing it out. So that's certainly the strategy, and it's very clear that we won't ever compromise land that we consider is required for future-proofing the airport.
And I presume when you're selling blocks, the reverse sensitivity or their ability to operate outside.
Fortunately, we have very, very detailed covenants on the title. So when people buy land on around the airport, they know, they're governed by the district plan, of course, but secondly, the airport has very clear rights. There's no rights to complain. All those sorts of elements are handled well in the covenants.
Thank you. Another question around, you made some comments. Firstly, question about how much of the business that's now moving in, and it's good to see more industrial growth at this point in time, which I guess is broad scale across the Waikato at the moment, a bit of an uplift. So in terms of amounts of businesses putting onto air freight versus road now, are we seeing any?
Look,
Trends
we're
there?
not, and I think the point that I think sometimes is lost on people is that basically 95% of freight is carried in commercial jets, passenger jets.
yeah,
So if you
yeah.
don't have a commercial passenger jet service, you don't really have a freight opportunity. There may be some specialist freight opportunities, equine, etc., but
Medical or whatever.
essentially you need the two. And in fact, the new aircraft, particularly places like South America, you're seeing Air New Zealand often flying with 60% passenger loadings because the belly's full of freight, and the overall weight restricts the number of passengers it can carry. So,
Okay, cool. Just good to know, keep ahead of that trend when we're thinking about other forms of transport, rail or road, because, you know, goods have got to move somewhere.
yes.
Another question, you talk about tourism a little bit in your report. Tourism is up, and visitor expenditure is up a little bit, which is a good trend. But in terms of the use of the actual airport, would it be mostly business and domestic tourism rather than it would?
Absolutely, so the tourism, the true tourism element for Hamilton Airport is relatively small, but in fact it's growing. So we're seeing evidence now of tour groups, particularly Southeast Asian tour groups, that are flying, for argument's sake, into Auckland. They're then doing they're doing Hobbiton and they're doing Rotorua. We have a better connectivity of air service out of Hamilton than Rotorua does, particularly onto Christchurch. So we're seeing some uplift there, but you're right. For the Waikato generally, 80% of tourism visitor nights are domestic. They're not international anyway. So.
So we need to get some more head offices here in Hamilton to get people travelling in. Because I just wondered if you had any thoughts. Well, I suppose it's too soon to say, but you know, the new government is now considering regionalising some of the ministries.
Yes.
So those, those journeys directly to Wellington might take some impact of that. If people like.
Look, I think there's already one ministry that had some very early talks with us about a design build opportunity up here as well. So I think there is some of that thinking already, even prior to the change of government. So, and look, just generally we are seeing a very strong uplift in government and associated quasi-government travel in the last 12 months. So. And particularly, I think, coupled with university, the agri-businesses, Christchurch and Palmerston North, with the Waikato.
True, thank you. One question, final question, if I might just flag to staff, and I was going to ask it in the last report, but then I was too slow. Just in terms of how dividends get treated when they do come to council, just at some stage, if I could understand where they go. Once they've been paid, dividends get paid to us, and that occurred in the previous presentation as well. Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
We can probably answer that now, can't we? They'll be in other revenue or something like that, I suppose.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I can send an email around that.
So they come in as revenue, yeah. I was just wondering how
where are they disclosed, you mean? So where do we see them in our accounts?
Yeah, and where do they get moved? I mean, they come in, they're revenue, we get that, but where then do they get applied to? Is it to debt or is it to some other area of, I mean, I just want to be clear that I understand.
Will be,
Applied to debt.
applied to debt.
Right, that's what I want to know. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Martin.
Thank you. Very good presentation. I'm also mindful that this is in the public arena, and it's a given that things that are commercially sensitive that the shareholder should know will be relayed through our CE, and we always have a closed session available, obviously, for those kind of updates. Several questions, and I'll make probably a brief comment, but the property sales, I've noticed a very stunning billboard on one side, and I think it would be useful if you could also send a map of what you own, what you lease, what you're selling, you know, because in terms of you know, representation of where the farm, that type of thing. But I did notice with great intriguing no development contributions as being a big sale pitch to sell some industrial land. As you know, our city, it is a historical anomaly that your airport is in the Waipa district, in my view, because of the stupid local government boundaries years ago, of which... Yes, yes. But, and I'm being constructive, but obviously we do have an interest as a city in that kind of promotion. Why is that? Is that because Waipa is not collecting?
Correct, and I think historically, you know, we've seen the development, of course, generally in the Waikato has been to the north of Hamilton City in terms of the industrial commercial development, and so for a number of years there wasn't an appetite to invest and develop around the airport, and in fact you could expand that to Hautapu and Te Awamutu, etc. So I think but that's the legacy. We don't actually play too heavily on that. I mean, I think the more land that we're able to develop and start to sell, of course, that provides a confidence level for us as well. So we're seeing our square metre rate that we will sell land at rising. It's still, of course, cheaper than to the north of Hamilton City, but relative to where, and I think the general view of all the landowners around the airport that that we now need to get some traction on the square metre rate. But you're right, there aren't development contributions.
No, it's a bit of a quirk, but certainly from our point of view, it is albeit it's in another local authority, is a Hamilton Industrial Park. So
there's another aspect to it in terms of the level of service that are connected to at Titanium Park and at the airport. So effectively the roading falls onto a state highway for the most part, and they don't have wastewater solutions out there either. So the levels of service isn't commensurate with that of Hamilton.
To pay.
Yeah, very good point, Richard. Yep.
The other thing, I'll just make an observation, if you haven't already done so, with regard to your transport access relating to the Southern Links and NZTA, I would assume automatically there'll be a Hamilton City, Mr. Chris Allen, engineer in that discussion, because obviously while you are technically in Waipa, even at a micro level, the city has a critical interest in how the airport precinct is joined with Southern Links and is joined with the access routes, and obviously how it relates to the completed Waikato Expressway, the Southern Links development. So I'm just making an observation. I would expect a member of our staff to be also right across even some of that micro access issues to the airport, if I may say. The other thing, can I just, interesting, and again, you may be somewhat vague in your response. You talk about conference, you know, promoting a conference. You also have a partnership with a hotel on your precinct, and I'm just wondering probably how that balances off in terms of having a complementary package that helps a leaseholder also.
Absolutely, and look, we engage well with the airport hotel in that sense. Obviously, you know, inverted commas, we're sovereign businesses, so but I think bearing in mind that we only really completed this upgrade last month, so it's relatively new for us. But we've already been in discussion with the conference organiser at the airport hotel, and there will be opportunity. They're already referring opportunities to us and vice versa. So
there's a kind of a synergy.
Yeah,
can be
that's right.
Not a win-loss, but a potential win-win.
I think so.
With growth of traffic, growth of conference.
Yep.
The other thing, and perhaps that is, obviously, I'll say to you from your 50% shareholder. Obviously, confidentially, as appropriate, keep us abreast of any discussion with Jetstar, because as a city, obviously, we're, without bagging Air New Zealand, we keenly note the risk register around a monopoly type aspect of one provider. Coming to the South Island entryway, because it means you can avoid the horrendous Wellington weather and transit to a degree. I'm intrigued that you'd use Wellington to go off to overseas, but that's a cool Christchurch, yes. But what potential do you think we have to grow that tourist market and business market into a South Island using Christchurch as a hub, you know, Hamilton direct, and cutting out that Wellington?
Look, I think that is growing. We are seeing that increase. Some of those decisions, of course, there is a decision-making chain here that starts with obviously with the customer, but also with the inbound tour operators, and then with the airlines and how they want to make those fares attractive for that. One of the challenges for the regional routes is that the airfares are not as attractive as moving groups or on the jet service.
Sure.
And so it is a bit of a challenge. But I think no question that the first stage that we're seeing is that inbound tour operators are housing first night and last night often in the Waikato now, because moving them into Auckland and out of Auckland City to go south is a bit of a nightmare. So I guess that's the first indicator that even though it's ground transport and doesn't help the airport, but it's an indicator that the industry is having to think differently about how they transit in and out of Auckland.
And the other thing, just talking about Auckland, I know you've touched on it, and again, I don't know what other models you've got. Can you just come back? We obviously regret the loss of that commuter service from Hamilton to Auckland, which was the option for people, particularly doing early morning Trans-Tasman, subject to weather. I've just been going over Chicken and Hamilton, so even if you're in the greater Waikato, I thought that was a brilliant service, and I know that's Air New Zealand's choice to. What potential is there to sort of revisit? I mean, can you just go back? I know you did cover it slightly.
Look, I think there's two aspects here. One, I think firstly, if you like, in fairness to the airline, they took out their beach aircraft, their 19-seater aircraft, and now their smallest aircraft is a 48-seater.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So they've more than doubled the capacity with those aircraft, and on a route that was marginal under a 19-seater framework, becomes even less marginal with a larger aircraft. So that's the first point.
More marginal.
More margin. That's right. Yes, more marginal. Thanks, Gary. So that's a big challenge. First of all, is to fill the aircraft, and that's why I think ultimately it has to be part of a wider strategy and not just a Hamilton Auckland for international, for onward travel. Hamilton Auckland international. It makes a lot of sense. For a domestic transit, not a lot of sense, because you've still got to get from Auckland Airport into Auckland City. The Waterview Tunnel's made a difference to that commute time within Auckland from the airport to the city. So there is some opportunity there, but fundamentally it has to support, as I say, that base use has to be quite high. So you'd have to have 20, 25 seats going out every day just that want a Hamilton-Auckland service.
So watch the space really in terms of a perspective of how you can build that. To what degree, from a marketing point of view in the wider region, and I'm just trying to work out the cut-off between Tauranga and Rotorua airports, and then the northern part of Waikato, the pocket vis-a-vis Auckland Airport, once the expressway's all done, and the current expressway is finished by 2020 and hopefully maybe progressing south, what sort of thoughts are you doing about your intense marketing in the wider Waikato region in terms of being the hub rather than people looking to Auckland, Rotorua or Tauranga?
Yeah, and look, this comes back to that fundamental question of the role of the airport company and what marketing. So look, we have just started now, in fact, very recently, a social media engagement that we haven't had to date. So look, I think that this goes back to the earlier research piece, that we understand now the behaviours and the perceptions of the market. It's now trying to determine how we as an airport company can A, influence it, and B, provide information to the airline that might influence that as well. The Rotorua, Tauranga, Hamilton airport piece is an interesting one. People in that whole region will make decisions on where they arrive and depart from, often based on schedule. Not so, and sometimes of course price, but probably from regional airports it's going to be a schedule decision. So, I live part way between Tauranga and Hamilton, or I live at Tauranga, but I can come over to Hamilton. We are seeing, I think, a change in behaviour because our car park revenue, if you like, is growing at a disproportionate rate to our passenger revenue, passenger numbers, which suggests to us that the demographic of use of the car park is changing. So people are coming that have to park at the airport. So perhaps they don't live locally, they can't be dropped off, it's not economic to taxi. So I think the catchment for the airport is definitely growing.
And the final question, at risk of being one of the 160,000 experts that know about streets and know how to run airports because we can see it and use it, so we're exported, because I wish you well for improving the parking issue, you know, trying to affect the technology where people can just do the zip zap and get out, rather than that queue type of stuff.
Yes.
Good luck for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you. And just be wary that we will get a deal, a go at setting the direction of the airport when we go about setting their statement of intent and all that, statement of expectation, all that sort of stuff. So there's another bite of the cherry. So we are just be aware, because we are running out of time. And
Stress that we must not forget the need for confidential meeting with and probably that comes more in the statement of intent, I suspect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, thank you, Martin. Mark?
One very short one, thanks, Gary. Uber, end of the year, are we going to be an Uber-friendly airport, or are we going to be Christchurch?
Are Uber running planes now?
No, but they take passengers from the airport. Interesting.
We have already engaged with Uber, so we're aware that they are coming and intend to come. Look, our approach philosophically is to be an approachable, friendly airport. But we do want to capture the opportunity because it needs to be a level playing field.
Absolutely.
So they haven't given a date yet for their entry into the Waikato, but certainly we've had that initial engagement.
Right, so because Christchurch has got quite a hostile sort of a relationship, haven't they? And
yes, and Wellington has gone quite the opposite, and that seems to be working well. So there is some precedent setting that we can follow and understand.
But it's on the radar.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. No more questions? I'll move the report be received. Can I just remind members, and this has been a really good, useful, but today we're accepting what happened in the past and making sure the records are there. So we will be able to deal with what we want to do with the airport going forward through a later meeting. All right, I'll move it. Sorry, Paula. You're going to second. Mallet, Southgate. Those in favour. Those against. Carried. There was no one against. Thank you. That was unanimous. Now we have some visitors here. I suggest that what we will do, we'll have a break now. Thank you, Mark and Carlos. Well done, Carlos. Didn't say a word. Thank you. I suggest that we'll have a break for tea, 10 minutes, and we will move the accessible properties people who are here now. Sorry, not move the people, move your item till straight after our 10-minute cup of tea. And I see also that the Waikato Innovation Park folks are here. All right, okay. And so what that means is the 10-year monitoring report, which is 9, 10, 11, items 9, 10 and 11, will be moved to later in the meeting. I don't have to move that, do I? No. Okay. Thank you.